according to Bethesda Game Studios, Starfield's design language and themes are rooted in the very real history of human spaceflight, and it is pretty wild. He was launched into outer space, soaked in his own urine. So, buckle up for the real history behind Starfield. Starfield has you become a member of Constellation, the last group of explorers dedicated to the question of what's out there. But in real life, believe it or not, before the Cold War, the idea of actually physically traveling to outer space wasn't really on people's minds. Now, that's not to say the idea of space didn't fascinate us. It did, but realistically, getting off this rock was purely the realm of fiction, and even that took some time to evolve. Space travel was depicted as early as 125 AD in Lucian of Samosata's A True Story, which depicted him traveling to the moon via a whirlwind, as they do. But really, the story was more a critique of Homeric epics like the Odyssey. In the time of the ancient Greeks, our understanding of space would drastically change, but our relationship with space travel wouldn't alter until the Renaissance with Nicolaus Copernicus. While all the way back in ancient Greek times, Aristarchus of Samos was the first to realize the Earth revolved around the sun, and not the other way around, and even predicted that stars were distant suns. It was around 1543 and the publication of Copernicus's work showing the same that this idea would take off. This would be furthered by the likes of Galileo and Johannes Kepler, who in 1611 wrote Somnium. Somnium was published after his death in 1634 and describes, in strangely accurate detail, what the Earth would look like from the moon. It's also been argued to be one of the first works of science fiction. Either way, while we were fascinated by the stars, the idea of traveling there, not so much. In fact, it wasn't until the 1800s, and in particular Jules Verne's 1865 novel From Earth to the Moon, that the idea of traveling to space started to actually gain popularity. It involved building a space gun called the Columbiad, which would shoot people to the moon. In 1880, a newspaper referred to the Columbiad as a spaceship, marking the first recorded use of the term. In fact, it's what inspired the 1902 film Le Voyage dans la Lune, or A Trip to the Moon. In real life, 3 scientists around the world would separately be inspired by the likes of science fiction, and all separately be given the distinction Father of Rocketry. First, we travel to Russia. Here, the Russian scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was inspired by Jules Verne's story, and in 1903 he would release his work, Exploration of Cosmic Space by Means of Reaction Devices. While actual flight to the stars was years away, this was massive. In his work, he introduced his Tsiolkovsky equation, which measured the horizontal speed required by a rocket to orbit the Earth. In 1911, he released Exploration of Outer Space by Means of Rocket Devices, and also published a theory in 1929 envisioning a multi-stage rocket. Meanwhile, in the United States, there was Robert H. Goddard. While Tsiolkovsky was inspired by From Earth to the Moon, Goddard was inspired to travel to space by H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. Unaware of Tsiolkovsky, he independently developed a rocket equation, and by 1915 had started to test rockets. His breakthroughs were considered the true beginnings of rockets and space exploration. By 1919, the Smithsonian, who was funding much of his experiments, published his work as A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes, and by 1924 he had published his own article, How My Speed Rocket Can Propel Itself in Vacuum, for the magazine Popular Science. Unfortunately, he was ridiculed outside of the scientific community, and newspapers wrote him off as a moon man with insane ideas, completely taking his work out of context. People taking things out of context? Some things never change. While Goddard passed away in 1945, prior to the start of NASA, he inspired General Jimmy Doolittle, with whom he laid out the foundation of rocket development, and who would go on to help transition NACA, or the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, into the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, or NASA, in 1958. Finally, we need to take a trip to Romania and Hermann Oberth. Like Tsiolkovsky in Russia, Oberth was also inspired by Jules Verne's tales of travel to outer space. in particular from the Earth to the Moon and around the Moon. His doctoral dissertation was privately published in 1923 as The Rocket to Interplanetary Space, which inspired the German Spaceflight Society. In 1929, he had written the book Ways to Spaceflight and served as a scientific advisor on the film The Woman in the Moon, which in and of itself helped to majorly popularize the idea of space exploration, like his contemporaries in other countries, who, again, I want to emphasize, didn't know of each other or their works. He also realized the importance of multi-stage rockets. Hermann Oberth had an impressive list of students who studied under him who would go on to contribute in their own major ways to space travel, in particular Wernher von Braun, who later helped create the Saturn V rockets, making it possible for the moon landing missions. Between these three fathers of rocketry, the idea is there. Rockets could maybe take us to outer space. Then, something happened in the late 1930s and early 1940s. World War II erupted across the globe. It had many implications, but in terms of rockets, it meant the construction of the V-2. Wernher von Braun, the student of Hermann Oberth, had utilized Robert H. Goddard's research in rocketry, and even asked for advice prior to the war breaking out in building rockets for Germany. And during the war, by 1942, they'd finally achieved success. While these were meant for war, and used for war, these rockets would serve as a blueprint for the future, and after World War II wrapped up in 1945, a new conflict was brewing, and things were about to get very, very cold. Quickly after World War II, tensions between the United States and the USSR ramped up. The US wanted to rebuild war-torn Europe and promote democracy, whereas Stalin wanted to stop this and maintain support through spreading communism. This led to the formation of NATO in 1949, several proxy wars, and the space race. You see, those V-2 rockets Germany had pioneered were found by both the US and USSR, and while the US didn't have a rocket program, they expatriated Wernher von Braun and his engineers from Nazi Germany in 1945. They set him up in New Mexico to run further rocket experiments, utilize V-2s, and trained American engineers. All of this led to the first photos of Earth from outer space in 1946.
The rotation of the rocket causes the planet to spin before the lens, and the camera photographs the Earth 65 miles straight down. The horizon, 720 miles away, and the curvature of the Earth are astonishingly apparent in this still picture from the film.
In March 1955, it was Disney who would help ignite a fire in public interest, broadcasting a Disneyland animated episode titled Man in Space, which detailed then current progress in rocket technology and dreams of Tomorrowland.
In the pits, the required quantity of fuel is preset. The pumps will deliver 1,230 tons of hydrazine and red fuming nitric acid into the tanks of the waiting rocket.
Around 40 million people watched this. In fact, President Eisenhower requested a copy to show Pentagon rocket experts, and the Soviets wanted a copy too. Then, July 1955, President Eisenhower's press secretary, James C. Haggerty, announced the US intended to launch small Earth-circling satellites into space somewhere between 1957 and 1958. And in response, the Soviets said, "Nyet, we're gonna do it first." The Soviet Academy of Sciences procured funding purely for the sake of beating the United States to the punch. The space race was on. The year, 1957. The Soviets, not wanting to lose to the US, picked up the pace on their project, and on October 4th, 1957, launched a fellow traveler, or Sputnik, into space. And it was a success. Sputnik orbited the Earth, transmitting a distinct beeping signal radio towers could pick up. The Soviets had launched the first successful satellite, which, rather than being exciting, in the United States, caused a panic. Russia suddenly seemed to be technologically superior to the United States, and who knew what they could do militarily if they had access to outer space? As a result, Eisenhower bumped up the launch date for the American satellite, Project Vanguard, to December 6, 1957, which would broadcast live on TV for Americans everywhere. And, like a Bethesda game on launch day, they still had a few bugs to work out. Not the proudest moment in American history. Moving into 1958, the United States finally saw some success. Just 1 month after the disastrous launch of Project Vanguard, on January 31, 1958, von Braun successfully launched a rocket for the US containing the satellite Explorer 1. The US were in this race. On July 29, 1958, NASA was formed, and by August, they'd sent Explorer 6 into space, which became the first satellite to snap a photo of Earth from orbit. Now that humans could put a satellite into space, it was only a matter of time before we put a human into space. On April 9, 1959, NASA announced the Mercury 7, consisting of Alan Shepard, Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, and Dickie Slayton. These 7 had been meticulously chosen from a group of military test pilots and were put through months of grueling tests to make sure they had the right stuff. These men would be dubbed astronauts, to mean star explorers. The suits they wore were Mercury spacesuits and originally made for high-altitude fighter aircraft pilots. They were pressure suits meant to protect the pilots in case of sudden depressurization in outer space. Astronauts breathed in oxygen via a hose connected to their waist, and the air circulated out of the side of their helmet. The suits all had a nylon exterior with an aluminum-coated fabric, which would help reflect external heat and gave the suits their silver color. But before any country would send humans into space, they first experimented on some of our furry friends to ensure the safety of space travel. First up was in Russia and the dog Laika in 1957. While Laika was the first dog and mammal in orbit, sadly, she died of overheating just hours into the mission. In 1960, Russia would try again, sending the dogs Belka and Strika into space, joined by 42 mice, a gray rabbit, 2 rats, flies, and various plants. Fortunately, this time all of the passengers survived and safely returned to Earth. On the US front, it was decided to send a chimpanzee into suborbit first due to their similarities to humans. At the young age of just 3.5 years old, Ham the chimpanzee was launched into space on January 31st, 1961. While there were some issues on the flight, Ham landed safely back on Earth and went on to live until he was 25. This launch proved that it would be safe to send a human into space, and NASA prepared to launch the first of the Mercury 7 later that year. However, while the US had been hard at work, so too had the Soviet Union. Like the Mercury 7, the Soviet Union had also put together a team of future cosmonauts, or sailors of the universe, selected from the Air Force and put through rigorous training. 12 were initially approved, and when they were asked to vote for who they would send into space first outside of themselves, just about every candidate voted for Yuri Gagarin. He was put in an accelerated program dubbed the Vanguard 6. And on April 12, 1961, Russia launched Yuri aboard the Vostok 1 into outer space. This first flight would be automatic with no manual control. But still, for 108 minutes, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth and became the first man in outer space and an international celebrity. It was certainly a blow to the United States, but they weren't too far behind. Less than 1 month later, on May 5, 1961, the United States launched the Freedom 7 and the first of the Mercury 7 into space, Alan B. Shepard. His flight didn't go off without a hitch, though. Shepard entered his spacecraft at around 5:20 a.m. and expected to launch within 5 minutes. However, there were 4 hours of delays, leading to him needing to pee in a suit that hadn't been made with getting rid of human waste. In other words, he was launched into outer space, soaked in his own urine.
Suit thermometer says freon flow, jumping from 30 to 45.
Shepard's flight was only 15 minutes long. However, it was a success. And while he stayed suborbital, unlike Yuri, Shepard did have some manual control over his flight. Alan Shepard returned a national hero.
This decoration, which has gone from the ground up here.
While both the Soviet Union and US had sent a man to space, over the coming years, they would fight over different milestones. In 1965, the Soviets' Alexei Leonov became the first man to ever perform a spacewalk. While the Soviet Union was obtaining more achievements at a quicker rate during the start of the space race, the US would have a bigger goal in mind. By 1961, Eisenhower, who had invested much into America's space program, was out, and Kennedy was in, who had been much more critical of the spending. However, remember that whole Sputnik scare after the Soviets succeeded in sending a satellite into orbit first? Well, Yuri Gagarin and the Soviets beating the States to outer space had a similar effect. Afterwards, Kennedy changed his tune, and eventually he famously chose to pursue the Apollo program to get America to the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The goal was to get to the moon by 1970, but there were still many achievements that had to happen first. Enter Project Gemini. These spaceships were the next stage after Mercury, and the goal was to advance space travel for the US to the point where Project Apollo and the moon missions would be possible. It was here in 1965 that Ed White would perform the first US spacewalk.
Okay, I rolled off, I'm rolling to the right now. It's under my own influence. There goes a... looks like a thermal glove, Jim. It is, yes. Ah.
Outside of the space missions themselves, another major achievement was about to commence in the name of peace. In January 1967, the US, UK, and USSR all signed the Treaty on Principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. And that is a mouthful. The treaty states no weapons of mass destruction can enter outer space, countries are liable for the damage caused by their space objects, and that nothing in outer space can belong to any country. As of recording, 114 countries are now part of this treaty. Sadly, the year was also the first with major disasters. In January 1967, during a ground test of the Apollo 1, on the same day the treaty was signed, an electric spark caused a fire which killed the crew, including veteran pilots Gus Grissom of the Mercury 7, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, where this was to be his first mission. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the Soyuz 1, a part of the Soviets' very own lunar program, launched in April the same year. It suffered from multiple problems, and its pilot, Vladimir Komarov, was killed as a result. The tragedies rocked their respective nations, but the mission remained clear: the moon. On the US side, an initiative was started to create brand new spacesuits during the Apollo program. This new suit was finished by Apollo 9 and is perhaps the most recognizable spacesuit, as it was also worn on the actual moon missions. The design is so iconic, it would go on to influence the look of the Constellation suits of Starfield, and in part, where that NASA punk aesthetic comes from. These suits were built to handle the changing pressures that would be involved in space missions. They passed in oxygen to the wearer through various tubes and included 6 life support connectors. The outer garment included integrated thermal micrometeoroid garments to protect the suit from abrasions and astronauts from solar radiation and micrometeoroids. Also included was a liquid cooling garment to circulate water and keep its water cool. In order to actually land on the moon, there was another major hurdle NASA had to solve: the actual landing part. For this, NASA developed a lunar module that was designed specifically for the moon's atmosphere and gravity. Astronauts like Neil Armstrong used a lunar landing training vehicle that was designed to replicate what it would feel like piloting a craft on the moon. Generally, this went well, but not always without incident, as Neil Armstrong was forced to eject on his 21st flight. Multiple Apollo missions were sent out, and each one closer than the last. On July 16, 1969, just about at Kennedy's initial deadline for reaching the moon, Apollo 11 blasted off into outer space. Apollo 11 was crewed by Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, and the mission was broadcast back down to Earth. The 3 successfully made it into the moon's orbit, and both Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin got aboard the lunar module to descend onto the moon into the Sea of Tranquility, a spot that was deemed to be safe for landing. However, the trajectory wasn't quite what they predicted, with a massive crater and rocks all around it.
We continue on down the surface. We should have been on the surface by about 10 minutes, and now, as a result of this trajectory problem we had, we're further downrange from our landing site.
On top of that, various computer program alarms went off, first at 12:02 and then at 12:01. It was decided that it was just as dangerous to try to re-enter the Apollo 11 as to land, and the mission continued forward. As they searched for a good landing spot, fuel on the lunar module slowly became critically low. Finally, with only 1 minute left of fuel before Buzz and Neil would have to abort the mission, they found a landing spot. Apollo 11's lunar module successfully landed on the moon, and with that, on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong would successfully be the first man to ever step on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Buzz Aldrin followed, and after propping up an American flag as well as performing other ceremonial duties, Armstrong and Aldrin successfully rejoined the Apollo 11, and the team returned to Earth as heroes. While the landing had been a success, for many, that was it. What else was there? Mission accomplished. This led to eventual budget cuts to NASA, meaning that many future lunar missions were scrapped. That said, the space race wasn't quite over yet. In 1971, the USSR launched the Salyut 1 into space, which would be the first ever space station. Meanwhile, in 1974, the US sent Skylab into space, which would be their first space station. The Soviets and US even collaborated on a project, with 1975 seeing the Apollo-Soyuz test project come to fruition, which was the first successful docking of spacecrafts from two different nations. In 1981, NASA launched the first crewed orbital test flight of a space shuttle, with the program remaining in operation until 2011. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, both the Cold War and the space race. But while it had been one of the primary motivators to get us into space, that didn't mean the end for space exploration. If anything, hopefully, it marked a true beginning. In 1993, Vice President Al Gore and Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin announced a new joint space station project, which would become the International Space Station. Assembly began in 1998, and the first module launched into space on November 20, 1998. Over the course of 2 years, more parts were launched into space and assembled. Finally, in November 2000, the first long-term residents arrived on the space station, and it's now been occupied for over 22 years. That said, there are plans for the International Space Station to be decommissioned by 2031. But don't fret, as commercial replacement facilities are planned to go up before then, so we can always maintain a presence in space, and hey, maybe get one step closer to the space stations of Starfield. Meanwhile, the first Mars rover, Sojourner, launched to Mars on December 4, 1996, and landed on July 5, 1997. And today, there are multiple rovers on Mars conducting research. And while space exploration used to be funded and guided by the government, today, space travel has become privatized. SpaceX, founded in 2002, developed the first rocket to land vertically and be able to reuse its booster. This ability to reuse rockets has significantly reduced the cost of traveling to space. There are also plans to send humans to Mars, with one US proposal hoping to see this sometime in the 2030s, and Russia hopeful to do it in the 2040s. That said, according to Starfield's official website and timeline, we're not going to land on Mars until 2050, although if that's a predictor of the future, we'll be living in space by 2100. If there's one thing I learned while working on this video, it's not to underestimate the power of science fiction. After all, it was the likes of Jules Verne's and H.G. Wells' science fiction works that would serve as the spark to inspire the very first dreamers and scientific creators of rockets. And with an all-new, massive game inspired in parts by NASA and the space race, who knows what dreamers will be inspired in real life. I hope you enjoyed this first episode of The Real History of. Next week we'll be covering Cyberpunk 2077 and the real history of cybernetic implants. Let us know what you think, positive or negative. I really do read the comments and take feedback to heart. So let us know if you want to see more.